It was May of last year, and I had just signed the lease on a new house. It turned out that the refrigerator didn't come with the deal. I'd spent most of my money on the house, so I started looking for a cheap one at garage sales. I couldn't find one anywhere. Then I remembered that there was Craigslist. After just 10 minutes, one popped up, not far from me. I called the number, and a nice lady answered. She said the refrigerator was still for sale, but she couldn't guarantee it would still be there when I arrived. So, against my better judgment, I asked for her PayPal and sent her $75. She sent me an email confirming she'd got the money, and we set up a date for me to pick it up. That Saturday, I texted her, letting her know I was on my way. The house was a nice, ranchy style place, probably built in the 80s. I knocked, and this hot, brown-haired girl in very short cutoffs answered. After I picked my jaw up from the ground, I asked for Sunny. She said that was her, and showed me inside. I had zero reason to be nervous. Like the outside, the house was nicely furnished and smelled clean. We made small talk for a few minutes, until this big dude, at least 6'5", covered in tattoos, appeared from the kitchen. She introduced him as John, her boyfriend, and she said he would take me to the refrigerator. She disappeared to the back of the house, and I never saw her again. John led me through the kitchen to the garage. He opened the door and pointed to the refrigerator. It was all the way across from me, almost sitting against the overhead door. I could barely see it because the garage itself was so dark. I asked him if there was a light, but he said it had broken and that they hadn't had the chance to fix it. No big deal. He had to open the overhead door so I could move it out anyway. I asked him to raise it, but he said it was also broken. He apologized. I was just going to have to bring it through the house, which annoyed me, but I had no choice at that point. There was a little light shining in from the house. It was going to have to do. I took 2 steps, maybe 3, into the garage, before I realized there was plastic on the floor. I looked down and saw that it covered the entire floor. This was when I began getting nervous. I couldn't think of any reason why it would be there, except I stopped in my tracks. John's shadow began drawing closer. Then, off in the corner, to my left, I heard a shuffling noise. Everything inside me said to leave. Suddenly, I turned around and walked quickly back to the open door. I was surprised to see how close John actually was to me, but I kept going. I weaved around him and said, "I forgot my dolly in my truck. I'll be right back." There was a dolly leaning against the wall not far away. He pointed to it and began to say something, but I didn't stop. When I was sure he wasn't behind me anymore, I ran the rest of the way, out the door, all the way to my truck. I hopped in it and tore out of there. I don't know what happened after that. I got a few texts from Dom, but I erased them without reading them. When I got home, I logged on to Craigslist to report them. I was shocked to see the listing was already gone. I looked around for another 30 minutes to make sure. Thousands of folks get stuff off there every day with no trouble. After what happened to me, I just don't think it's worth the risk. However, if you do find something on the site, you just have to be careful. Bring a friend when you go to get it. If you can, meet in a public place during the day. Most importantly though, use your head. If the situation seems sketchy, bail. It may mean the difference between life and death. Yours. Anybody who's a father out there knows we'll bend over backwards for our kids, especially for our daughters. Mine is at that age where she's learning to ride a bike. She's off training wheels, and because of the rate at which she's growing, she was ready for a better bicycle. The two of us sat down and browsed the internet for ideas. As you can imagine, she liked the more expensive models. I didn't have the heart to tell her we didn't have the money for a new one. So, I waited till I was alone and searched for used ones. That's how I came across Craigslist. There were a few available in our area, but they were beat to hell. If I was going to pass it off as a new, I needed a bike in good shape. I continued to look and eventually found a like-new bike for a good price. Almost too good. My suspicions were raised, but I figured I'd check it out anyway. If it was in worse shape than the photos let on, I'd walk away. My wife and I went to the seller's house to see it. To my surprise, it was just as nice, almost brand new. I smelled a rat and questioned the seller. He claimed he had purchased it for his daughter, but she only rode it a handful of times. The bike showed a very little use, so I took him at his word. I paid the man and we took it home. My daughter's birthday was coming up, and we decided to give it to her then. I hid it away in our shed until the time came. The morning of her party, I let her outside. I told her to cover her eyes, and when I gave the okay, I unveiled the bike. She was naturally ecstatic. I got a big, huge hug and a big thank you. She hopped on and rode it until her party that afternoon. I figured my job had been done and the bike would last her a few years, at least. The next few weeks were life as normal. My daughter rode with her friends after school and weekends. Other than adjusting the seat, I had little work to do on it. I should have expected something would go wrong. It was a Sunday afternoon. My daughter, who we'll call Alex, was riding in the street in front of the house with her cousin. All of a sudden, I hear some screaming and crying outside. I run out to see what was wrong, and Alex is sitting in the street, holding her leg. As I got closer, I saw blood pouring out of it. I'll admit, I got a bit nervous. I reached her and asked her what had happened. Now that I was there, I could see just how bad the injury was. Halfway down, on the inside of her left leg, the skin was split to the bone. I could see the muscle, in fact. Alex was bawling her head off, and I tried to calm her down. Once again, I asked her what happened. Lucky for me, her cousin wasn't fazed. He pointed behind me and said, "The pedal broke off and cut her." I turned around, and there was a pedal on the ground. I picked it up and noticed the part connecting the pedal to the crank arm is sheared off, leaving behind sharp little points. The other half was still on the crank and had left some sharp pieces. I started getting angry when I realized the post steel looked like some cheap pot metal instead. I'm not sure if I'm describing this well, but imagine a stick broken in half. The two pieces you have left have sharp points located at the break. Essentially, you are left with two sharp sticks. Well, I sent the cousin inside to tell my wife about what happened, while I whisked Alex off to the ER. I wasn't sure how to apply first aid, so I left it alone. Once we reached the hospital, I left them to treat the wound. Alex eventually got some painkillers, and she calmed down. She got the leg sewn up, and we made arrangements with a cosmetic surgeon to have it prettied up. This entire time, I'm quietly seething over the pedal's shoddy quality. We made it home that night, and I scoured the internet for information about the bike. It turned out this is a common problem with this particular bike. So common, in fact, they had a recall to replace the pedals. Learning this did my burning fury no good. The recall had been made over 2 years prior to me buying the bike. As I calmed down, though, I realized I was guilty for not checking up on it more thoroughly. I'll own that. That may have contributed to my anger. I've already apologized to Alex and my wife for failing as a father. While I was in the process of my apology tour, a nugget found its way into my head. I wonder if the seller was aware of this problem and withheld it from me. It ate away at me until I was driven to call and ask. I played my cards close to my vest early on. My question was simply stated, and I left out Alex's injury. He tried to say it had slipped his mind. Then he went on to say all I needed to do was contact the company to get a free pair of pedals. It shouldn't be much trouble. I imagine it's a simple process. This was when I lost my cool and pounced. "Oh yeah? Then why don't you do it before selling it? My daughter has a giant gash in her leg because you were too lazy to send off for the free pedals. Either that or you sold it knowing full well what could happen. Which is it?" I'd blindsided him. He just mumbled, never able to come up with an appropriate response. I was so mad by this time I was positive he'd sold the bike knowing of the dangers associated and the existence of the recall. He'd done as much as to admit it. That's the moment I decided to sue him. "I'll see you in court, a-hole." Except I called him the whole word. I hung up before he could respond. It was the best I'd felt in weeks. Although, I should have consulted with our lawyer before saying it. He was sure we would have a case. I initially wanted to go for the big bucks. The guy was a doctor after all. However, after I cooled off, all I really wanted was Alex's medical bills paid and an apology. Our lawyer and his would exchange some phone calls back and forth until they agreed to settle. Alex got her bills taken care of, and he promised to meet face to face for an apology. Later that week, he met us at lunch and apologized to me. He surprised me and even apologized to Alex. She accepted it gracefully, and I thanked him for showing up. I had become so wrapped in my own little search for revenge, I had forgotten one important thing. My wonderful daughter no longer had a bicycle. There was no way in hell I was going to let her ride that death trap again. So, I took a huge hunk of our tax return and bought her a brand new one. It's what I should have done in the first place. I spent a whole week of nights after work researching the pros and cons of several bikes until I chose the best one. It was more than I wanted to spend, but after all, if we don't think of our child's safety ahead of money, we don't deserve their love. This may sound strange to some people, but I collect movies on VHS. My collection is currently at over 1,000 and growing daily. I spend my weekends searching through thrift shops and online sellers for interesting and hard to find cassettes. Sometimes, I'll purchase lots or boxes of tapes. These often include home recordings of forgotten television shows and family memories deemed no longer important. At times, I love nothing more than to cuddle up and watch them with my girlfriend. Although most turn out to be boring, I occasionally stumble upon something very special. A couple of years ago, I was browsing through Craigslist and came across a box of cassettes. It was taking up space and they wanted it gone, afraid of the first person to show up. So, I pounced on the deal. An hour later, I was parked in front of my TV with a big box of tapes. The haul totaled 44. Many were blank or home recordings lacking labels. Oh well, I always love a mystery. I had a few hours before work and watched a tape or two on fast forward. The first had an episode of the original Battlestar Galactica, and the other was blank. Once I was done, I pushed the box into the closet and left for work. It would stay there for another 9 months, untouched and forgotten. In the meantime, I bought countless more tapes and my collection began to take over my spare bedroom. I built a massive shelf to store it all and inventoried each tape as I shelved it. This is how I remembered the box in my closet. When I realized I hadn't finished watching each tape, I set aside an evening with my girlfriend to do so. I remember that night like it was yesterday. My girlfriend, Brittany, arrived just after 7 p.m. We made dinner together and had Butterfinger ice cream for dessert. At about 9, we crawled up together and started the first tape. The next few hours, we saw a recording of NBC Primetime from 1987, 3 movies from HBO, and a wedding from 1991. Brittany especially loved that one. The fourth tape was also a wedding. I watched as much as I could before opting on a pee break and having a smoke. When I stepped away, she was fully engrossed in the ceremony. After I hit the head, I slipped out on the porch for a cigarette. That only took 5 minutes, max. Before I returned to the bedroom, I grabbed a refill of water. I was in the process of doing this when I heard Brittany scream my name. I ran into the room as fast as possible. She had her hands over her mouth and her eyes were the size of saucers. Her gaze seemed to be fixed on the TV screen. What? I said. I leaned over the TV but saw nothing but a blue screen. I asked her again. She remained speechless, but pressed rewind on the VCR. A few seconds later, she pressed play and patted on the spot next to her. I assumed this meant sit down, so I did. The tape began as the happy couple prepared to cut the cake. I got annoyed and asked, "What is going on with you?" "Wait a second, it's coming." The words were so sudden I jumped. So, I kept watching, waiting for some mystery thing to occur. The couple were feeding one another cake, and the recording cut out. Static blared at us for a moment before a new recording began. Now, a man was staring at us. He looked to be starting a video camera. When he moved away from the camera, you could see a nude woman laying on a bed. The guy hopped on the bed, and they began doing it. "Alright, baby," I said in a joking way. Brittany snapped and told me to shut up. By this point, I was completely dumbfounded. I almost felt embarrassed watching it. I'd never thought of myself as the voyeuristic type. The couple continued coupling, and the woman whispered, "Choke me." He did, and the sex began to peak. I'm thinking, kinky to myself. Not my thing, but to each his own. The man continues to choke the woman. She began gasping for air, but he didn't stop. Even when she grabbed his arms, he kept going. He completed the act and let go of her throat. The couple laid quietly together for a few moments and said nothing. Suddenly, the man turns toward the woman. He stares for a few seconds, then raises his elbows and starts shaking her. The dude's yelling her name and occasionally slapping her cheeks, but she's not moving. This is when I started to catch on. The man then stands up, now holding his partner by the shoulders and shaking her. Still no movement. This is when he started to catch on. He eventually stops and just stares into her empty eyes. No way, man. I'm beginning to freak out now. No way, dude. Brittany is silent. The man sat down on the edge of the bed, his head buried in his hands. A low sobbing can be heard. This goes on for a few moments before he remembers the camera. In one long motion, he reaches out and slams his hand down on it. The blaring of the static returned, and I sat struck dumb. The hissing continued until Brittany finally pressed stop. Dude, it was the only word I could get out. I'd never seen anything like that before. Brittany turned toward me and asked what we should do. I honestly had no idea. I still couldn't believe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. Let me have a smoke and I'll consider our options. I retreated outside to think. When I returned, I proposed the idea that it may have been fake. I don't want to go to the cops until I'm sure it's real. No way do I want to become the butt of some troll joke. Okay. If she had any misgivings, she kept them to herself. She may have still been in shock, and no, I was. Our evening was clearly over. I suggested she stay the night, but she declined. No big deal. I'd have a hard time getting any sleep until I knew the truth. My first goal was to contact the tape's previous owner. I knew for sure the man in the tape was not the dude I got the box from. There was a good chance he may know his identity. My emails went unanswered. I tried to contact him by phone, but his number was no longer working. I finally went over to his place and discovered that he'd moved away. Without a way to contact him, my option had run out. Off to the police it would be. The cops said they would watch the video and contact me if they had any additional questions. It was out of my hands now. In the weeks during my search, I'd seen very little of Brittany. She always had some excuse. I figured it was only a matter of time before she ended things completely. Another week would pass before she'd call. I can't do this anymore. I haven't slept for weeks. All I see is that dead woman. There was no sense in arguing. I wished her a good life and hung up. It would have been heartless to expect her to let it go. God knows I'd had my share of bad dreams over the past month. Things like that tend to affect women a lot harder than us. If her feelings change in the future, I'm not hard to find. Hundreds of cassettes have passed through my hands since then, with my room now becoming scarce. I've taken to selling blank tapes and extra copies of films. With Brittany no longer in the picture, I admit, curling up in bed and watching tapes has lost a bit of its luster. Most of my viewing takes place in the living room now. To this day, every time I put an unlabeled tape in the player, I get a little tinge of fear. Will I see someone die? I've had a lot of time to think it over. When you collect something that captures a moment in time, a silver of someone's life, you never know what terrible secret you may uncover.